Hello, and welcome to the Rules of the Game podcast, where it is my job to discuss democratic institutions. The US democracy is at a critical juncture. The two-party system, that is a consequence of the single-seat plurality elections, doesn't balance political groups well. The two parties are highly polarized, making political compromise almost impossible, and the democratic institutions are captured by the two parties, excluding other outsider parties. Extreme gerrymandering has made most electoral districts non-competitive, so that elections become pre-decided and leave voters with even less political choice and power. With Jack Santucci, I discuss how electoral reform to introduce proportional representation could be an essential solution to the US political gridlock by making congressional elections more dynamic and leading to better representation. The window of opportunity for reform may be short though, as the Republican Party is increasingly controlled by politicians that disregard democratic principles. The perils of hardly contestable political offices become more real by the day. Also concerning is that many reform suggestions would just not make the electoral system proportional enough to disrupt the two-party impasse. Jack has conducted some of the most comprehensive research on the history of US electoral reform, which is going to be published in his forthcoming book, More Parties or No Parties: The Politics of Electoral Reform in America, available next year at Oxford University Press. The book lays out a shifting coalitions theory of electoral reform and analyzes a wave of ranked-ballot reforms in American cities during the Progressive Era and the New Deal. Jack Santucci is an assistant teaching professor of politics at Drexel University. He got his PhD in political science from Georgetown University, and during the academic year 2017-18, he was a research fellow at the Democracy Fund. Before graduate school, he worked at the International Foundation for Electoral Systems, the Campaign Finance Institute, Fair Vote, Café Bonaparte, and the Congressional District Office. If you want to stay up to date with what are the core issues in US electoral reform, follow his research and his Twitter discussions. I will link to both in the show notes. I really do admire his work. I am your host, Stefan Keiberts, and this is the 12th episode of my podcast, The Rules of the Game. I am a political economist with a PhD in economics from the University of Bern in Switzerland, and I previously held positions at the London School of Economics and Political Science and the Center for Global Development. You'll find a full transcript of the conversation on my website, rulesofthegame.blog. If you enjoy this episode, please leave a review on your preferred podcast platform and share it with friends and colleagues. Now please enjoy this wide-ranging conversation with Jack Santucci. Jack Santucci, welcome to the Rules of the Game podcast. I'm very happy to have you on the show.
It's good to be here.
So as usually, and the question I ask all my guests on the podcast, what is your first memory of democracy or maybe of politics in general?
Over here in the United States, we have something called kindergarten. And for me, that would have been 1988 into 1989. And we as kindergarteners, a 4-year-old at that time, we were asked to vote in the presidential election which was between George H.W. Bush and Michael Dukakis. Bush was the Republican, Dukakis was the Democrat. And I think that if you wanted to vote for Bush, you dipped your right hand in blue paint. And if you wanted to vote for Dukakis, you dipped your left hand in red paint, because at that point, the red and the blue had been sort of, the colors were used in an opposite manner. And I think the way in which I made my choice had to do with which hand was dominant. So I voted for Bush simply because I was a right-handed person.
That sounds like a very nice memory, and also a very artistic way of, of voting.
Yeah, and then
So cool.
there was a thing on the wall that had sort of kitty handprints.
Okay.
Yeah.
I love that. That's very cool. And then, at what point in your life have you kind of decided to do research on electoral reform, and also then at some point write your upcoming book by Oxford University Press, More Parties or No Parties: The Politics of Electoral Reform in America? So that book is coming out probably next year. I don't know. And
I don't know. They
you don't know yet.
they have everything from me, and they've had it for a little while now, and we'll see. You're probably right. You may know more about this than I do, but it's happening.
Okay, cool. Yeah, congrats to that anyway.
Thanks, man.
And
Yep.
so when did you feel that you needed to contribute to that discussion?
I don't really know how I became interested in electoral systems. I know that I got out of college or university at McGill in 2005 with that interest, and I don't know what planted it in my head. I don't even think that I had a course on comparative electoral systems at McGill. But anyway, from there, I went into an internship at Fair Vote, which was then still known as the Center for Voting and Democracy. And my job there was basically to promote the idea of proportional representation. And there were these 24 cities. Now we know that there were actually 25, but there were 24 cities that had the single transferable vote at one point. And they kind of had a mythical status in the reform movement. It was sort of, wow, these great systems they had in these cities. That proves that it could happen again. So that was in the back of my mind, and I went off and did a whole bunch of other jobs. But then it came time to sort of pick a dissertation topic. And I said, well, let's get to the bottom of what really happened there.
And now you're kind of in the middle of a very important and very great discussion. I think that somehow I feel in the US is only really now developing, and we can discuss still where it's going or where it might be going. But maybe for our listeners, just to get some of the fundamentals of the systems debate we were having, and the US is especially having now, about majoritarian systems and proportional systems. So the US uses a majoritarian system with single seat districts and simple plurality voting, versus proportional system that allocates seats more according to vote shares that parties win. From your perspective, what are kind of the downsides of the US system that you're currently using, and what would proportional representation bring to the table? How would it change really the game of elections and representation? I mean, it's a big question, I know.
Yeah, no, I think we have I mean, just focusing on Congress alone,
Yes.
focusing on the House of Representatives to keep things simple. I think we have a range of electoral systems in use in the United States, and it sort of depends on what variables you bring into characterizing them. You're right that they're all single seat districts. And it's interesting that you say majoritarian, because they're all basically 2-round systems, really, because there's a nominating stage. And at the nominating stage, that's voters making those decisions, whether you have to affiliate with a party or not to participate in the making of that decision. And then now, of course, we have the conversation in the United States about getting rid of party nominations altogether, which would bring us in the direction of a sort of more pure 2-round system, I guess. And then we have PR, which you've described as allocating seats to parties roughly in proportion to their vote shares, although I'm not sure ranked choice PR works in that way. But the immediate benefit of any sort of PR system for U.S. House elections would be majority rule. And there are a few political scientists who sort of look at PR in this way, that not in the way that, say, Ferdinand Hermans would have looked at it, which is if you have PR, you're going to blow up your party system and have all sorts of fragmentation. Another way to look at this is that, when you have a PR system, the party or the coalition with a majority of votes gets a majority of seats. it's majority rule. And I think that's the key benefit to Americans from PR. And that's sort of not what we're getting under the current electoral rules for various reasons. And at certain times, the party with fewer votes than its main opponent gets a majority of seats, which is what happened in 2012. So.
Right. And some of the problems that the PR proportional representation could really solve are like gerrymandering, because for PR, you kind of need to get rid of the single seat districts, right? You would move to multi-seat districts that just allow for a better representation of different groups in a district. And I think this is just one of the fundamental problems that could be actually resolved, and that is so much, it takes so much debate space at the moment, this whole gerrymandering discussion. And from a European perspective, most people don't even really know what this is all about, right?
Yeah, there's no question whatsoever that if you move to a system of multi-seat districts, gerrymandering is going to get a lot more difficult. No question.
Exactly. Yeah, it's not.
Yeah,
it's true. It's not impossible. It's still depending on the system that you essentially adopt. But
it just as district magnitude increases, gerrymandering just gets objectively more difficult. I mean, you're absolutely right on that point.
Yeah, exactly. But I had actually this discussion on Twitter recently also, and just moving to multi-seat districts doesn't resolve it entirely. You also need to move to PR, to proportional representation.
Or you may. Well, why is that? Why do you distinguish between PR and multi-seat districts on that front?
Because if you had like multi-seat districts, but still a winner-takes-all system, you could still gerrymander. The party in power could still optimize their the number of seats they win.
Sure.
In your book, that is upcoming, you do like a deep dive, I think, into past experiences in the US of electoral reform, of proportional representation also, that was used in some cities. Can you give like a few examples, or also maybe your main insights from that deep dive? And I know in the book you go quite far. You do like a lot of analysis, I suppose. But what are kind of your main insights? Also on your website, you mention the shifting coalitions theory of electoral reform. Can you just give like a brief overview what you are going to talk about in the book?
Yeah, so the core of the book, and the book begins with this desire to understand what really happened with these single transferable vote or proportional ranked choice systems in American cities. We can talk about what can and can't be learned from cities in the 1920s, 30s, 40s, and 50s if you want. I'm going to leave that aside for a minute. But it takes those cases and puts them into the context of a larger conversation about the causes of electoral system change. So I draw on a lot of very painstaking research by other people into electoral reform episodes in comparative cases, sort of the iconic cases, Belgium, Switzerland, so on and so forth, New Zealand, Australia. And I would say the key sort of theoretical points or the key insights, general points one would make, that I make, is that electoral system change itself becomes common when you're in a period of shifting coalitions. So in the United States, we might talk about realignment or de-alignment. In Western Europe, you might talk about de-alignment or the departure of voters from traditional establishment parties to new parties, something like that. The point is that the sort of larger coalition structure of the polity is changing.
Right.
And that gets people sort of scampering for solutions.
Yeah, and that's what you mean with realignment or de-alignment, kind of realignment of new coalitions, right?
Yeah, so realignment might mean, here in the U.S. context, what policies opposing sides stand for, and the sorts of voters and interest groups that tend to support either side. And it's when those coalitions are shifting that people start to scamper and look for solutions at the level of electoral reform. So that's one key insight. The other big key insight, I think, is that the reform coalition is often more important than the reform itself. So there are a lot of people out there who think that PR or RCV is just a good idea and they don't really care how they get there. I would push back on that.
So the way of how to get there is really an important part, right?
Yeah, somebody needs to design the respective RCV system or the respective PR system. So a very sort of concrete example of how, and I think you're going to ask me later about the political economy of what was going on in some of these cities, but it's not. These movements are not motivated by a desire to expand democratic participation. They're motivated by a desire to make government run like a business. And, that's one part of the Reform Coalition. Arguably, it's a group of people who hate the entire idea of political parties. And then the other part of the Reform Coalition is a group of people who arguably are obsessed with proportional representation.
Mm-hmm.
And so, yeah, you have proportional representation all over the place. But so what if it comes with a massive reduction in the size of the local legislature? That's why the Reform Coalition is crucially important, arguably more important than the reform itself, because it shapes the reform. Is the point?
So in terms of political economy, really, so what are kind of the patterns that you observed in your research, and why also did those kind of reforms or that these implementations of new systems, why did they also in the end not survive? Because compared to let's say in Europe, right? Yeah. Most European countries introduced a proportional representation system,
right?
Usually first at the subnational level, but then also at the national level. But obviously, the political landscape was probably quite different in Europe at that time. Still, the discussion was present about proportional representation on both sides of the Atlantic, essentially. Yeah. But in Europe, most countries adopted a new system, while in the US it didn't happen, only at the very local level.
Yeah, the other thing that's rare about what happened in the United States is that PR gets repealed. That just simply doesn't happen anywhere else, except for, I think, in France in 1958. No, yes. 1958, and then again in the 1980s. But it's a fairly rare outcome. So the basic argument, so in addition to shifting coalitions being important in sort of getting people thinking about reform, the underlying number of parties matters. The number of parties that you go into a reform process with is important. The United States is unique, I think, in having tried to put proportional representation in front of a multi-party system. As you know, I think most other countries had multi-party politics before they adopted PR systems. And I think this is in part why the quote-unquote PR systems we get here in the United States are so anti-party in their design. For example, nonpartisan ballots. I would argue that undersized legislatures are themselves anti-party. Nomination by petition, I think, is an anti-party device. We can go on with what was anti-party here, but when you don't have a multi-party system, you don't have the sort of organizations needed to process a subsequent realignment. So the adoption of these systems sort of itself results from shifting coalitions, but coalitions continue to shift. And when so what happens is you get these reforms. The resulting political system is really polarized on a reform anti-reform dimension. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
There's the reformers and then the old machine in quotes.
Yeah.
Right, but when that coalition structure shifts again, people again start thinking about reform. Mm-hmm. Now, if you're in a multi-party system with a single transferable vote, parties kind of negotiate what the new coalition structure is going to look like. Here, that's not what happened. Here, people started using rankings in strange ways. Legislative behavior starts to become chaotic. City councils have hard times getting things done. And everybody says, that's enough, we're tired of this, and sort of blames the system. Then they start to say, STV is unpredictable. It generates lottery-style outcomes. Voters are confused by it, and so on and so forth. So the argument, right, is that this is what you get when you try to use reform to induce a multi-party system rather than use reform to channel one that already exists. The reforms themselves really don't survive subsequent realignments. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
That was a
Yeah,
lot
yeah.
that I just said.
Yeah,
but-
no, that makes sense. I think it's probably not always easy to follow, like, because there's so much going on, right, in terms of what is the structure, the existing structure, party structure, what are kind of the outside forces in politics that push for electoral reform, and how much are the parties in power actually interested in bringing about reform, right? And
So
the US system is really
yeah.
Exceptional in the sense that you only have two parties.
Yes.
And the primaries also, they play quite an important role. So there's a few characteristics, I think, that are just make the US case like the two parties make the system kind of try to fend off change in a way, right? Because the two parties usually, they have, at least every few years, they are back in power, right? So far, and that's why probably they are not they're not interested in changing the system.
Yeah,
Would you
I
agree?
think I think that's right. And the famous story about Western Europe, which is that PR adoption, or single member plurality adoption for that matter, is a sort of reaction to rising working class mobilization. Switzerland and the US, I think, are unique, though, on this, because in Switzerland, the adoption of PR is not, at least at the federal level, is not a story of incumbent elites trying to save their own skin, right? It's a bottom up, so what Georg Lutz calls reform from below, and that's what the U.S. cases were. Although I don't want to overstate the extent to which these are from below, because it's really a pro-business lobby in a lot of cases pushing this stuff.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, that's also what I talk about in one of my podcast episodes, how direct democracy, the initiative to actually change the constitution to introduce proportional representation, was crucial in Switzerland to get that reform, because otherwise who knows, we might still stick with the old system. But obviously there were different parties already existing.
Right.
So that was a bit different. So we had several parties, like the Catholic conservatives, but also the Social Democrats, and on the right side the farmers and kind of entrepreneurial party. And so they were pushing for change. But even the Catholic conservatives that were very powerful in some cantons, they were like divided on the issue, because essentially they had a lot of power in some regions, but not at quite enough, I think, at the national level. And so, but in the end, the parliament that was dominated by the radical Democratic Party, they always rejected any reform, because they were in power. And that's what usually we can observe, right, all around the world. But so the initiative was really the tool in Switzerland that allowed for the reform to happen.
Yeah.
In one of your blog posts, you make a very concrete suggestion for the introduction of an open list proportional representation system in districts of 3 to 5 seats, and you call it a modest and timely proposal. And you also you wrote it like I think last year, just before the 2 Senate elections in Georgia were like deciding whether the Democrats would have a majority in the Senate. And you said this is kind of a window of opportunity. Can you quickly elaborate on this proposal? Because I think it's very powerful, and it's because of its simplicity in a way. So it could also be interesting for a lot of other countries that are like using a more US style system at the moment.
Yeah, there's a lot to say about it, and there was a sort of immediate reason for it, and then there's a sort of deeper reason for it. But broadly, what the proposal says is take the Fair Representation Act, which
Mm-hmm.
Fair Vote has put a lot of hard thought into. And in particular, I think they've put a lot of hard thought into what kind of PR bill would get through Congress, if any could get through Congress. The only problem in the immediate term with that Fair Representation Act is the single transferable vote.
Mm-hmm.
Because it is objectively harder for voters to use, objectively harder for election officials to administer, and there's all sorts of setup cost right, and you don't have time to deal with setup cost when a term in the House of Representatives is 2 years. So I said, just go with what I'm now calling the one vote system. So from the perspective of an election administrator, this is indistinguishable from what we now have. You just count up the votes. From the perspective of a voter, it's largely indistinguishable from what we now have. You just pick your favorite person. And from the perspective of a candidate, I think it can be made to work in a way that's not too radically different from what we have now. So we have this multi-seat district. Let's just carve it up and make each candidate respond. So each let's say we have a 5-seat district. A party is running 5 candidates in that district. It divides up responsibility for parts of the districts among those candidates. And you might even use the current single seat districts as bailiwicks, basically. Are you familiar with the term bailiwick?
Not really.
Okay, it's
so maybe...
it's a subset of it's a portion of a larger geographic district that a candidate campaigns in and is responsible for constituent service in.
Okay, I see. So that is kind of almost for the primaries. Is that right?
Well, we with Matthew Schugarten asked me, have you thought about nominations at all in this system? And my answer was no. And he said, well, why don't we use nomination districts? And there are, I think, a couple of, so those again would be the existing single seat districts, right, that are now nested in a larger multi-seat district. I think there are a couple good reasons to do that. One is compliance with the Voting Rights Act. In other words, one way that we deal with minority representation issues here in the United States is by drawing single seat districts in certain ways, either to create what are called majority minority districts or minority influence districts. And rightly, I think people in the voting rights community worry about multi-seat districts undoing that settlement. This is one way to work with both groups, I think.
Right, because that was initially the idea of introducing the single seat districts, that minorities would have their own districts in a way, right? And is that the reason why, for example, the civil rights movement didn't bring up proportional represent? I mean, this maybe goes too far, but in a sense,
it doesn't.
I'm
I don't think it goes
surprised.
too far.
I'm surprised that the communities of color, that they don't advocate more for proportional representation, because proportional representation would allow them to be better represented or to even have their own party.
Complicated set of issues, sir. So I'm not entirely comfortable speaking for other people on this matter.
Sure.
But I will say that the civil rights movement had a complicated relationship with proportional representation in the cases I've looked at, and seems to have continued to have had a complicated relationship with proportional representation. So, Lonnie Guinier is one scholar who stands out as a sort of real champion of proportional systems, although some of them aren't really like cumulative voting. I would not call that proportional representation, but it's similar. But that's sort of been a minority position in the voting rights community. What else can I say about that?
Yeah, no, I was just wondering, which groups are likely to join the coalition for for reform. But otherwise, like from your proposal, what would you expect? So you would expect, a larger or outsider parties to be able to get seats in Congress, right? That is kind of the one of the main consequences.
I may be in the minority on this, but I think that my gut tells me that if you dropped open list proportional representation onto congressional elections tomorrow,
Mm-hmm.
you would not see high volumes of new party entry.
Mm-hmm.
I think you might see the Green Party win a few seats in California because it already exists there, organizationally speaking. Some have told me that there are factions of basically socialists in the Democratic Party who are like desperate to bolt, desperate to get out and form their own party. Maybe they would do that, and maybe they wouldn't in the first open list PR election. But I don't see this. So Lee Drutman argues in his book that there was a latent four-party system in the United States. Are you familiar with the
Yeah,
Doomlit
I've
book?
read it. Yeah.
I'm not sure. I don't think that if we dropped PR onto American congressional elections, we would just blow the party system into four equally sized parties, because there's more to a party than the electoral system in place.
Yeah,
There's
exactly.
a sociological dimension to this that doesn't come up sometimes.
Yeah, I think what is important is that parties can split, or new parties can be founded and win seats, and I think that's really the important issue. I wouldn't expect that the Republican and the Democratic party would just kind of break up and you would find a completely new structure, but I think it would bring a possibility for a dynamic, right? For new competition.
I think that's a good way to think about it, right? That if you were to drop PR onto U.S. House elections, you would be sort of relaxing a constraint.
Exactly.
But there are a lot of other things that keep people sticking with the two major parties in this country, one of them being presidential elections.
So. Exactly, yeah. I mean, you also see it, for example, in South Africa, right? That introduced PR with the new constitution in 94, and the ANC has still a majority in parliament. So things change very slowly if people believe in certain parties. And
there was a guy named Riker, and he came up with something called minimum winning coalition, and it turns out to matter, I think, more than what most people think is Duverger's law.
Okay. Right.
to your point about the ANC, yeah.
Yeah, I'll link to that in the show notes if you can give me the reference.
To Riker 67 or whatever it is.
Oh, yes. Okay. Yeah. I've come across that. So on the way forward, what do you think are the most likely, avenues of electoral reform for the US? What are kind of your biggest fears? What are your biggest hopes?
I don't really have a lot of hope these days for electoral reform. So coming back to this open list PR thing that we were talking about, one thing I do in the book is differentiate types of electoral reform from each other. And I'm just going to talk about two of them for now. One of them is sort of the incumbents insulating themselves, doing something to keep themselves in power. And another thing is the Switzerland in the United States cases, which I call a realigning reform episode, or a from below reform episode. What I was proposing in the open list PR blog post was an insulating episode. And the idea there was to say, hey, look, there's a realignment going on in American politics, and it's not good. All right, there are reasons to be scared and disoriented and all sorts of things by this realignment. And what the Democrats can do, we know we're going into a decennial redistricting and a reapportionment. Large parts of the congressional district maps from state to state to state to state to state are going to be drawn by the opposing party. The Democrats really could stand to insulate themselves by adopting PR now. And they have this brief window in which to do it. And if they do it, they are essentially buying themselves another 2 years in control of the House.
Yeah.
And that gives them time to maybe work through some of these difficult policy questions that are dividing the party right now. Now, you've seen me make a lot of noise about this. Other people have made noise about the open list PR proposal. And I'm led to believe that it's just not going to happen. So I think this gets me to my worry. My worry is that the party system is going to keep moving in a not great direction. Certain reformers are going to become more and more desperate to win what an old reformer in 1914 called demonstration cases. They're going to become more and more apt to compromise with whoever will work with them. And we're going to see a wave of really not great electoral reform at the state and local level. And what my big worry is how that interacts with a diminished voting rights regime. Does that make sense?
And what would be the interaction like?
So a very concrete example of this was, we look at the cases that I studied, the 24 PR cities. Those were all part of the council manager movement, which was an effort to, again, shrink the sizes of local assemblies, move to nonpartisan elections, in many cases move to off-cycle elections, not all. And you read the sort of urban history on what enabled the passage of these council manager systems. One factor was all of the voting restriction that sort of came online during the progressive era. So we know that in the American South as Jim Crow, but we know it in the North and maybe the Midwest as the requirement that voters re-register on tight deadlines, or literacy testings. One of my cases was New York City. In the same book that has the STV election results are the results of literacy tests. So when you kick a bunch of people out of the electorate, you can pass whatever you want. And then fast forward 50 years, I don't think once voting rights start to recover in the United States, I don't think it's an accident that the residue of these reforms starts to get challenged, right? About block vote or multiple non-transferable vote. Here in the United States, we call that at-large elections, and conventional wisdom is that that's bad for minority representation.
Mm-hmm.
So, my worry is that in a regime of restricted suffrage, really, reformers can kind of pass whatever they want.
And it looks like they are reforming, right, and improving, but it's not improving.
Precisely, they believe they believe that they're making things better because there's a sort of messianic faith in a ranked ballot or an approval ballot or a star voting ballot or a score voting ballot. Right, but there are other things going on in the political system, and I just worry that people sort of become useful idiots, really, for other goals. Exactly. I hope that doesn't happen. I hope I'm wrong about that. But.
Yeah, let's really hope that, because there are a lot of worries around regarding the U.S. political system, and
really?
I mean, and it has kind of developed, at least from the outside, it has gotten a lot worse in some ways. Some things that were taken for granted are not granted anymore.
Such as what's at the top of your mind?
Like voting rights, or that actually, in many areas it's getting harder again to vote. That's at least what I'm reading from what I see from the outside.
Yeah, we'll see how it evolves.
On the topic, I'm very much looking forward to reading your book, but also, what other articles or books would you recommend on the topic?
Oh yeah, if I could recommend one book to any and every person in the electoral reform community right now, it would be Votes from Seats: Logical Models of Electoral Systems by Matthew Shugart and Rain Tagapera. Because they really bring the science to these questions about what would you get or what could you get if you went to this or that electoral system. And in particular, they put the focus on assembly size, which nobody is talking about really in reform circles here in the United States. There's There's a broad acknowledgement that we probably should increase the size of the House of Representatives. Great idea. But one big problem, I think, during the progressive era was that nobody was sort of paying, they were so into proportional representation that they weren't paying attention to assembly size. And that's
Right.
really what mattered with these reforms. The PR was largely cosmetic.
Mm-hmm. So just for the listeners to recap, so I mean, assembly size should essentially increase with population size,
Yeah.
and it did for a while, right, in the US, but then it kind of leveled off.
Yeah,
Is
1910
that right?
was the last time it happened, I believe.
Mm-hmm. But that's also something we don't, talk much about in Switzerland either, for example. Or I think at the moment it's still kind of okay, but it's definitely something that discussing democratic institutions should include definitely like assembly size, especially at the local level as well. Any other articles, or that's really the one book you would recommend the most? Right?
I mean, if I have to pick one, I would really recommend that anybody who's serious about this stuff sit down and work through a highly technical book on electoral system design. Because like we're at a point with this conversation where like, yeah, PR is a cute idea and there's a thing called Duverger's law. And if we get rid of the spoiler effect, mono will fall from heaven. I think the issue is serious enough now in the United States to call for a serious treatment. And I'm not saying that, I'm not trying to knock on anybody. I'm saying like, we got to tech up if we're going to have a serious reform conversation here.
Yeah, I also obviously, Lee Drotman's book,
very good book,
Breaking the Two-Party Doom Loop, has been very influential recently.
No question.
I kind of wish he would have, called more for really proportional representation than, putting the ranked choice at the center of the book. But obviously, it's kind of attractive also because for voters, ranked choice is kind of something they might understand.
Well, I think this gets to another. I mean, I'm a big fan of the Drotman book, and the Drotman book has changed the conversation about electoral reform in the United States. There's
definitely
no question about that in my mind. But why ranked choice? And I think this gets back to the fundamental difficulty of putting broadly multi-party institutions in front of a multi-party system. So if you walk up to an American and say, hey, here's list PR, what do you think of that? They're going to say, I hate political parties. I want to burn them.
Okay.
And that's where this sort of fascination with approval voting and ranked ballots and all of this stuff comes from.
Yeah.
And the conversation in the like if you're serious about getting things done, the conversation is kind of constrained to anti-party reform solutions in this country. And I think that's partly why he emphasized ranked choice, although he does say that we should do it the way the Australians do it, which ironically works a lot like closed list PR.
Yeah, that's true. So people should really read your blog post on the modest proposal, because then you have like the beauty of both worlds, right? You can choose a candidate, so it's a personal voting. At the same time, you get a PR result, essentially.
Yeah, and there's the longer term reason for that thinking, and this is something I may be wrong about in the long run, but I don't think STV can work in a two-party system. I think, and then, well, Jack, what about Malta? Malta, there are other rules in Malta that maybe offset some of the effects that I'm going to talk about. But like when you have a realignment in a multi-party system, you have a coalition change. And the parties, right, there's structure, there's partisan structure to the new arrangement. Here in the United States, when you have a realignment, you get a period of sort of vote switching, ticket splitting, people crossing the aisle, maybe a centrist faction in the legislature. And all of this stuff I show for 3 key cases at least is what got STV repealed. So STV is sort of easy to pass relative to, I guess, list PR. Not that any of this stuff is easy to pass, but I don't see it as long-term stable in the United States. Now that's separate from expediency reasons for doing open lists. But thank you for recommending the blog post.
Cool.
Appreciate
Yeah. No,
it.
I really think it's a very clean and beautiful solution to many of the problems that the US has.
But hopefully it's a start.
Yes. Okay, cool. Jack, thanks a lot for this really interesting conversation. I feel we would have so many things to talk about, also in terms of, your research on what, kind of these reform movements in the past. There is so much more to uncover. But for now, I think we leave it at that. And yeah, hopefully we might have another conversation in the future.
I look forward to that, Stefan. Thank you very much for this.
Okay, cool. Thanks a lot for taking your time. Jack.
You got it.
Thanks for listening to this episode. If you liked it, please share it with friends or on social media, or leave a review on your preferred podcast platform. It really helps my podcast and my message to be heard. On my website, rulesofthegame.blog, you find a form to give feedback directly back to me, or just send me an email to stefan.keiberts@gmail.com. I would love to hear your comments or suggestions for upcoming episodes. Take care.